Hi, Steve Cassidy here again with part two of my history of the World Wide Web. In the first part we got up to the prehistory of the internet and how that was established, and we got to the point where the World Wide Web was about to be developed. So let's have a look at that. So in 1991 this chap called Tim Berners-Lee, who worked for the CERN physics lab, invented this thing called the World Wide Web, and what he was trying to do was to establish a way for helping scientists to exchange papers. Remember, we have the internet at this point, and it's being used to connect machines together. It's being used for email communication and various news services, so being able to exchange chat messages and things like that were very well established. What it wasn't very easy to do was exchange documents and find documents. There were various services around, but none of them were very easy to use. And so Tim Berners-Lee invented this thing called the World Wide Web. The idea was that there would be a web server running on a computer, and somebody could connect to that from somewhere else and browse different pages that were made available on that web server. He was using this thing called a Next computer as the first server. That was Steve Jobs' company. Was when he wasn't working for Apple, had this company called Next, which had at the time a fairly advanced graphical computer, and a lot of the technology, I guess, came back to Apple for their later machines. And he had a graphical browser for the Next OS and a line mode browser that worked on any Unix system. Unix systems at that time were the very common systems that were available in pretty much any lab that you would be connected to the network in. And very importantly, the CERN released the code for the World Wide Web, which was the name of the project, royalty-free in '93, a little while later. So they really wanted, that was a big key to having this thing take off. Let's have a quick look at what exactly Tim Berners-Lee invented in 1993. He was building on lots of things that had gone before, so very little of this was absolutely fresh and new, but he did make three big innovations and sort of standardized and built the infrastructure for these things. So if we look at these in order, the URL he invented, the idea of having an address that would correspond to a page on the World Wide Web. So it would begin with HTTP and have the structure that we know very well now, would be the address of a page and on the web. So each page has its own address, which is a URL, Uniform Resource Locator. He also invented the HTTP protocol. This is a way of exchanging web pages, so a way for a web browser to ask for a particular resource to a web server, and the web server can respond with that resource and give it back to the browser. And then the third thing that he invented was HTML, the hypertext markup language, which is a way of marking up text, writing down text such that it can be displayed in this way, and particularly with these hyperlinks, right, with the links that could be clicked on and would take you to a different page. Now, hypertext and hypermedia were very well established ideas at that time. HTML was a new language that TBL invented to become part of the web. And the simplicity of all these things, the simplicity of HTML, the simplicity of HTTP, and the nice obvious structure of the URL were all key factors in the success of the World Wide Web compared with the competitor technologies that were trying to do similar kind of things that were sort of more complicated and harder to understand. So a little while later, in 1993, remember TBL invented, he developed a web browser for the Next OS, but not many people had those. Most people had these Unix systems. So in 1993 we got the first graphical web browser for the Unix X Windows system, and then later that came on a Mac and a Commodore Amiga, which was the popular machines at the time. And this web browser was able to show embedded images for the first time, which is an innovation. And you could use the mouse to click on links and do things that we now take so much for granted. So 1993 was really the very, very start of this idea of a graphical browser for the web. The developer of the Mosaic browser, this chap called Mark Andreessen, left to start a company called Netscape, which would then become very big in the web industry in the future. In 94, a significant step in the internet was the unofficial ban on commercial use of the internet is lifted. So, as I said before in the previous video, the internet at this time was an academic network. There really weren't any commercial players, and it was in around the early 90s starting to become interesting for commercial players. Nothing like it is now, of course, but the companies were starting to want to send email to people in their organization and so on, and there was really a sort of an unofficial ban. It was frowned upon to carry out commercial activities on the internet, but in 94 that really stopped happening. The ARPANET remained sort of purely a research network, but that was really decommissioned earlier on than that. Around this time, one of the first spam email messages was sent. So this lawyer company, Cantor and Siegel, sent out a number of Usenet posts advertising their services, which is a green card lottery, and that just went out to lots and lots of people. It became the first spam message. In 1995, you saw the first commercial internet service providers connecting non-academic people to the internet. So this is about the first time that you could really get to use the internet if you weren't an academic or a member of a research organization. But at this time, remember, we just had the invention of the web, but really email is the source of most traffic on the net. In 1995, a momentous year was when a number of organizations came onto the web. It started sort of growing and growing. This is my very first page. Actually, it's not my very first page. I can't find a copy of my very first page, but this is an early page. That's me and my son, and just is me at Macquarie University. Around that time, Macquarie University got its own web page. Department of Computing at Macquarie got our own web page as well, and things started to grow very, very slowly to encompass more and more organizations. Most of the web pages that were put together at this time were done not in any real official capacity, but somebody in the organization decided that we should have a web page. So at the time I was working in the linguistics department, and I decided linguistics should have a web page, and I put it together myself. I installed the web server on a computer that we had and wrote some web pages, and there it was. It was on the World Wide Web, and that was how the web was growing at that time. One of the things that was difficult at this time was actually finding anything on the web, because there were just all of these separate websites springing up all over the place, and unless you happen to know the address of one of these, the URL of one of these sites, you wouldn't be able to find anything. So in 1994, Yahoo started its web indexing directory service, and what they did was they would manually put together an index of the web. They would just create lists of websites in certain areas. So they'd have one about cars, one about fish, and one about rockets, and so on. And you could find things in there, and if you had a new site, you'd send it to them and they would put it on their list in the right place. So this directory service began this company Yahoo. A little later, we started to see web search engines, which should actually go crawling over the web and index them and actually allow you to find things. So 1993, we saw the Excite search engines created by 6 undergrads from Stanford University. 94, Alta Vista and Lycos came into being. These search engines, they worked, but they weren't really all that good. They found you lots of results, but the first results that you found weren't actually necessarily the best ones or particularly relevant. And then in 1998, this company called Google launched. And one of the things that differentiated Google from all of the others was that they got the page ranking idea worked out. And so the first results that they produced would tend to be actually very good, quite relevant. And so they had their sort of trademark, patented, whatever, I'm feeling lucky button, which would take you to the first result in their web search, and that was really a key. So Google really took the place by storm and took over this idea of searching the web for content. So really we went from in 94 having to use this curated directory to in 98 being able to use Google to find things on the web, and it made a huge difference to the way that the usability of the World Wide Web. Around 96 we saw the browser wars. So this is a fairly interesting time in the history of the World Wide Web, when the commercial interests really took over the way that the web was evolving. The browser wars are really a sort of competition between the two companies, Netscape and Microsoft. Microsoft, obviously, we know, and they had a web browser called Internet Explorer that they had essentially they'd bought some source code from another company and developed it into their own web browser. And then this company Netscape, founded by Mark Anderson, who made the Mosaic software. And these two companies were trying to outcompete each other. They gave away the software that was their web browser, and they sold the server software and installed that in companies. And so they were looking for ways to differentiate themselves. And so they would introduce new features into the language of HTML that were really only compatible with their servers and their web browser, trying to get people to sort of adopt them and work with them. And what happened was that the HTML language, which started out being a nice standard way of describing pages, diverged, and so you got new features that would not work in one browser would work in the other, and so on. We saw huge innovations. So we saw the introduction of JavaScript and CSS and new tags and different ways to lay pages out and so on. But though it was really hard to construct pages that would work on both of these browsers, let alone some lower browsers like Opera, which was a third player in this kind of competition. As it happens, Netscape lost. Netscape itself, the company, sort of really fizzled out, and the Mozilla project, which gave birth to the Firefox browser, sort of came out of the Netscape model. And Microsoft, after going through various iterations of their browser, sort of won the browser wars and was the major browser for a long time, until really Chrome came along from Google to sort of knock it off its perch. And so it was a very difficult time in trying to deal with the standardization. Luckily, we came out of this and ended up with a much better standardization. And so these days, it is certainly the case that you can write HTML that will work most of the time on most browsers, and things are compatible with each other. So in the late 90s, that certainly wasn't the case. Okay, so we'll finish that off there. We'll come back for a third installment to see how things went in the late 90s and look at some particular areas of technology and content that evolved.